So we have a lot to cover today, and we're going to be kicked off by a short talk by Anders. I do want to say I really, really couldn't be happier to really welcome you as one of my favorite thinkers, really alive today, also hailing from one of my really favorite organizations. And so Anders is a researcher at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford. And recently we've had the great fortune of you accepting to join as a senior research fellow at Foresight as well, and join our community here. And it's really fantastic to have you. We had a lot of really fun discussions, both public and amongst our junior and senior fellows already. And it's been really just a tremendous pleasure. And yeah, I will share a few of those talks already, but I remember when Peter Eckersley introduced us actually a few years ago, because Peter knew I was working on a book, and he said, well, Anders is also working on a book. It would be kind of fun for you to meet, and it would be fun to discuss this book on positive futures that we're both writing. Man, little did I know, I had no idea what kind of book you were writing. I mean, the book is called Grand Futures. I'm hoping I'm not giving away too much, but I think it's best thought about as the book to contain all books. Since reading this book, I feel like every other book that I read is a detailed exploration of a chapter of the book that you're writing. And so it's really the most ambitious work that I know, both in terms of, I think, the scale. So the scale covered all the way from human history to the very, very, very end. But also, I think, really in terms of the depth and ingenuity and love and poetry that you put into this, and that shows on every page. And also, I think, really in terms of the optimism that it inspires in people. And so I'm incredibly eager for you to publish this. I'm dying to have everyone read it that I know. I do think it's one of the most hopeful things that I have ever read. It's really fantastic. Anyway, no pressure on you now, but yeah, of course, today we can't cover the whole thing. So you had tasked me with the almost impossible task of choosing a subsection. And so today we're focusing on what will happen, hopefully. Let's see what you're actually going to focus on. But potentially we may focus on what may happen if we just pass that tech coordination insight hurdle that we're currently struggling with in humanity. And so what's available for a post-scarcity civilization. And so this is a little bit for us to have as a carrot to mosey our way through the current COVID epidemic, I think. And so I'm super happy for you to present on that. And then I'm hoping that either through that presentation or afterwards we can cover cognitive enhancement and the future thereof as well. If I don't cover it here, then please, if you're interested in that as an audience, please just ping us, and I will collect questions in the chat. I will post a lot of links on you and all the detailed background on you here in the chat as well. But for now, I don't want to take further away from you. I'm incredibly thrilled to have you here. Welcome to the family, and I can't wait for your little intro talk.
Well, thank you so much, Alison. It's a delight to be here again. And of course, that presentation also inflated expectations tremendously. I think we all should remember an engineer at the Starship Enterprise who pointed out that managing expectations is the most important thing in looking like a genius. So I think henceforth we should start saying dissing the book instead, so people get pleasantly surprised by that it actually just contains one or two useful things. But anyway, thank you so much. So my big problem is that I'm one of those truly unruly researchers who give professors gray hair, and let's not even get into administrators and editors because I can't keep to one thing. This is sometimes very, very useful, and sometimes it's actually a real problem. So what I'm trying to do with my big project, the Grand Futures book, is outline, okay, if we play our cards right, how much can we hope for? So again, I'm totally failing even inside my own book with expectation management, because I'm showing that various very nice things seems to be possible. And I use that to estimate a rough ceiling for the possible. There are some things that are most likely not possible at all, but if the things that look possible are really, really awesome, like a post-scarcity society, like much greater levels of well-being, with really long lives, settling space, etc., etc., we have a lot to look forward to when it comes to the future. And that means that we both have a good reason to want to get to the future and a good reason to fight very hard to make sure that the future comes about, that we don't go extinct prematurely, that we don't get trapped into some kind of Hobbesian everybody's war against everybody else, or flub it in some other profound way. Now, the big problem here is, of course, that that project is ridiculously, crazily ambitious. And I find myself digging into the most bizarre sidetracks. This morning was spent reading up about evolution of language. I ended up with a little mathematical model where I'm trying to figure out exactly how much divergence should we expect in languages once we settle the solar system or have generationships or interstellar communications. And my very preliminary finding, assuming I did the math right, was there is a surprisingly small amount of lowest common denominator Hollywood movies or whatever future counterpart is that needs to be distributed widely to keep the languages somewhat correlated. That was surprising to me, and I don't really know whether this actually holds up. The deeper question is, of course, well, how much can human society diverge on very long and very large timescales? But that's not the focus for today. Now we're going to be near term or tomorrow, just the next 50 years or something like that, right? So in many ways, having this kind of Zoom meeting and being terribly embarrassed by coughing is a good demonstration of the fallibility of a lot of futurism. A year ago, if somebody had asked, so what do you think, Anders, you're going to do in the Foresight meeting in the next, in 1 year? I would of course have predicted, well, I'm going to be somewhere in nice California and I'm going to be sitting in a room chatting with people. I would not have expected a telemeeting. Today, of course, this is obvious. We're all doing it. And I think most of us will also make the prediction that next year, this meeting might very well also be virtual, or at least have a strong virtual component. Some of us might indeed be in a nice room together, but we have probably reached that threshold where enough people have enough tools that are useful and are getting used to them, that we end up making the virtual meeting a new standard. It just took a pandemic for it to happen. Now, the interesting part here is that there have been pandemics in the past, but they didn't trigger this technology because the technology wasn't really ready for it. In 1918, the Spanish flu certainly led to a situation where people stayed apart, but there was no way you could actually have meetings by using telegraph. And perhaps if this had been an outbreak of SARS, in that case, well, the technology was closer. But Skype was still young. Most people didn't have good enough bandwidth. I think what happened here was it triggered a transition that sooner or later would happen. But there is also patterning, of course, to this transition. We are still using tools that have been developed for a certain idea about how you interact in a corporate setting. And I'm kind of astonished that there haven't been more innovation yet in these virtual meeting tools to allow all the versions and variations that exist in actual meetings. For example, at Reuben College, a new college in Oxford where I'm a fellow, we discovered that doing this kind of voting by acclamation, where we all say aye about some really boring point of order, didn't work that well over Zoom. It's a trivial thing. There ought to be a plugin for this. And I have absolutely no doubt that there are some systems that do have that. And it's going to emerge. But still, this moment then led to this phase transition. Conversely, we also have this interesting thing that coughing went from something slightly annoying over to a sign of disease. Every time you cough, you think, maybe this is it. Maybe I got COVID. This is probably not going to last quite as long, because there are many problematic things in life where you simply can't sustain the same behavior. A few years back, for example, it was discovered that cooking a lot of food produced acrylamide, which is not good for you. And for about 1 day, people stayed away from the fried potatoes and the bread in the canteen. And then, of course, people started eating them anyway, because you don't change your food habits that strongly. There is a natural inertia that's very strong, and actually avoiding coughing is very hard. Actually avoiding bread, well, it's tricky. You could certainly do it, but it's hard to build a culture where this is stable. So I think this is an interesting demonstration of the problem of making this kind of prediction about the future, because we have enough of these random events. And again, the COVID pandemic was very much a random surprise that was totally unsurprising, because everybody in epidemiology knew that those coronaviruses are constantly evolving, and sooner or later probably it's going to be an outbreak. But it's a bit like rolling 6 ones on a bunch of dice. It's a low probability event. It happens eventually, but you can't predict when it happens. Of course, the other tool for people studying the future is to go for the really safe bets. So we might say, okay, let's look at trend forecasting. So everybody's favorite trend, like Moore's law, we can extrapolate that really far. The problem is, of course, at this point, it's bound to be some pessimists in the audience pointing out, wait a minute, Moore's law possibly can't continue because there are physical limits it's going to bump into. And indeed, there are many other practical problems. So in a technical sense, the Dennard scaling that was underlying Moore's law, of course, started dying around 2006. We're not making the components of the chips smaller and smaller. Instead, we have to do other things. So the clock frequency is not going up. Instead, we're going for parallelization. Now, for many purposes, this doesn't matter at all, because we're still getting more computations per dollar per second, which is what we normally care about. Only the people further down into the actual Silicon Valley really care about the real estate of the chip. But it also changes the kind of computations that are easy. So long serial computations are getting more expensive, but if you can run something in parallel, and thank heavens that neural networks and all the really cool stuff we're doing right now are very embarrassingly parallel, it works really well. So here, Moore's law, in some sense, continues, except that it causes a change in the kind of computations we do. Similarly, back in 1970 or so, we had another important break. Back then, up until 1971 or 72, there was an almost perfect correlation between GDP per capita and energy use per capita in every country. And an economist would just say, of course, if you want to have a richer economy, you need to use more energy. That's dead obvious. Then the oil crisis hit and the curve turned essentially horizontal. We have still gotten richer, but we're using essentially the same amount of energy per capita. One can quibble with the data, trying to see whether it's that we are using energy in some other places that are not counted. But the basic story is people got way more energy efficient at a very quick turn on a dime, I think this is the American expression. The interesting thing happening was the shock of the oil price going up, the realization that, we're dependent on countries we don't quite like, and so on, really transformed things. Later, of course, other important things have happened to energy, both in terms of fracking, but also in terms of the now probably unstoppable avalanche of renewable energy from solar power. Now, the interesting thing is, this is the kind of trend break that if you can predict it well, then you can make a good name for yourself as a futurist. The problem is, of course, most of the time we're just suggesting various trend breaks, and if one of them happens, we get interviewed about it, and then we sound very smart. And since you are smart and critical people, you will, of course, know that not to trust futurists to get interviewed for having made that one lucky prediction. It's rather, we want to figure out useful things about the future rather than being right once or twice. So my approach in my book is looking very much at the outer limits of what looks like it's physically possible, looking at some lower bounds of what's possible by using exploratory engineering, like the work of Eric Drexler on nanotechnology. And that gives us a rough sense of where the borderland probably is. And then we can, of course, look at trends. But we don't really know whether those trends will continue all the way. We can give sometimes good argument for it. Sometimes I think, though, it's better to give arguments why trends might suddenly change. For example, in demography, we have been that's another one of those hallmarks of sensible futurism. You make a guess based on population growth. And since it's so slow, you can actually make rather far into the future predictions. The problem, as demographers like to point out, is that while mortality has been going down and actually doesn't seem to be doing anything too weird, unless we get a really nasty pandemic, the birth rates are all over the place. And indeed, they have turned out to be much more flexible than anybody would have expected. Back in 1967, when James Blish wrote A Torrent of Faces, the great science fiction novel about an overpopulated future, in my opinion, he was kind of convinced that, having a 2% per year in a growth rate of population would keep on going until there is a disaster. And there was practically nothing anybody could do to actually slow things down, because people have evolved to have a lot of kids. That's not true. It turned out that indeed 1967 was peak fertility for mankind. The overall growth rate was kind of peaking back then. And then it went down because of female education, the demographic transition in more and more countries, and to a large degree cultural factors that you can't even predict very well because they're just like television. You watch telenovelas and see high status people having few kids, because it's very hard to have kid actors on a telenovela and a soap opera, and you consciously or unconsciously imitate that. And this is, of course, the bane of making these long-term predictions. Where I want to go is, of course, can we make better decision-making instead? Understanding the possible causal paths is perhaps more useful for figuring out what we ought to be doing. As I like to call it, the next Tuesday problem. After you heard my talk, how does that change what you do next Tuesday? And it seems to me that there are various things that we can do that are useful here. Figuring out what's at stake is very valuable. Having insights both about what kind of value there are out there and how much of it is, that is quite useful. For example, once you realize that, whoa, we can achieve quite a lot of wonderful things by having nanotechnology, then you want to go in that direction. So one of the obvious early decisions is we want to promote that. And then we can get into the more practical question, how do you promote that particular technology? Conversely, we can look for the nasty risks and start thinking about how do we avoid them. We might also go meta and say, do we have some general patterns in this domain that we ought to pursue, like differential technology development? Can we foresee some obvious bad uses of a technology and figure out a way of staving them off before they actually happen? And I might not be able to imagine, let's say, how to keep geoengineering safe. But if I see that as a problem, I might get funding and put out prices to get people to pursue ways of, let's say, cleaning up the stratosphere if it turns out that the dust we put up there was of the wrong kind. Incidentally, that might also be useful for fixing things like asteroid or supervolcanic or nuclear winters, which are other things we don't like to have. So one tool I've been toying around with here is looking at kind of if-then scenarios. So we can imagine an interesting future technology and ask, what are the preconditions for getting them? And then we can work out those preconditions and see more about the details. So we can imagine, for example, if we have a future where we achieve, let's say, Robert Freitas' Foresight, little nano devices that you have in your bloodstream that contain compressed oxygen and would allow you to hold your breath for 45 minutes, which would be super useful in sport, very nice if you get a heart attack, really cool for scuba divers, etc. What does it take to get it? Well, first of all, you need the nanotechnology he describes in his paper, which is a fairly advanced one. And that nanotechnology would require, well, you need to be able to do mechanosynthesis of a fairly complex system, essentially a little sphere of diamonoid that contains little pumps. You need to develop the design methods that allow you to do that. And you need to develop testing methods, both virtual and practical, so you can make something that's somewhat safe. You also need to have the automated manufacturing that actually enable you to do this at scale. Well, what does these things need? Well, the mechanosynthesis and the automated manufacturing need the basic nanotechnology. So we can kind of see a tech tree starting with simple nanotechnology leading to better nanotechnology, leading to better one, eventually leading to the manufacturing and the mechanosynthesis that allow you to make it. But the Foresight also requires things like testing and approval mechanisms, which are total political software. They need to be in the software world of FDA and the European healthcare agencies, etc. We also need to figure out a bunch of things about biocompatible surfaces. Now I have a little tech tree here, and I can analyze this in even more detail. It's also useful for thinking about priorities. So this particular little tech tree was part of a bigger exercise I did about a year ago for a completely different project. And I ended up with about a dozen of these ones. And then I just put them together into a giant, very, very confusing one. It looked very impressive on the cover of the report. And I used graph methods to try to figure out where are the crucial steps, which are the steps where most pathways are going through. So they told me, oh, here are the places where I really want to speed things up. Or if I think of some of the downstream things are really scary and dangerous, this is where we might slow things down. So for example, nanotechnology is a very key step. And understanding that dynamics in detail, well, that's of course part of Foresight Institute history, and understand that part. We have some other interesting examples like understanding pro-social emotions and the manipulation of them. This is in the moral enhancement part of my tech tree. And again, it's a powerful technology with some rather scary implications, but also some very good implications. Now I end up with this model, and ideally, in the best of all possible worlds, all of you and the various organizations would be making their own, and then we compare them and try to find where are the robust patterns. Because that's the final part, of course, in the secret of actually thinking well about the near term, realizing that you can't rely on one big theory. Philip Tetlock famously pointed out that we're really crappy about talking about the near future. Why? Well, most of us have one big theory about how it's supposed to look, and it's mostly wrong. The better ones, the foxes, tend to combine different theories. But of course, his main finding was it's still going to be fairly unreliable. The real value is not making that grand prediction, but the real value is coming up with, here is a crucial point that if I push on it, it's going to speed things up. Or I can slow things down. And that allows me to then actually decide on what I do next Tuesday. So that's roughly my overview of my methodology, which has already been going on far too long here. I think I got the impression from the chat that there is a lot way more concrete questions that maybe I should now go on to try to demonstrate that one can apply some of this thinking. What do you say, Alison?
Many of them are for me. Right, just giving people an understanding of all the things that we could be discussing, because I'm figuring that not everyone, or I'm probably thinking like the very few subsection of this group has actually read the book draft. So I just wanted to give people an outlook of all the things that.
Yeah, my book draft, after all, is just a draft. I think the interesting question is actually where do you think the best questions are here?
Well, I mean, a lot of people uploaded the whole brain emulation questions immediately. So let me give you like a few of them, and maybe you can decide which ones you want to tackle first, and then I'm going to try to weave in the rest. And that's for everyone in the chat, a reminder to please upvote or downvote my questions or express your interest, and also add your own, and then I'm going to weave them in as Anders answers. But one thing that, and even though you haven't touched on it very specifically yet, but you've definitely done a lot of work on whole brain emulations before. And so a few questions that I immediately had is, what kind of different scenarios are possible there? How has your thinking updated since the roadmap? And how do they fit in with superintelligence, if at all? So that's
great, yeah. So whole brain emulation is sometimes called mind uploading. And I really hate the term mind uploading because it's both unclear what the mind is, and the whole concept of uploading is kind of linked to the traditional idea about moving things between a small computer and a big computer. Brain emulation, on the other hand, is a bit closer, but it might still be confusing. So the basic idea is you take a biological brain, you scan it somehow, you produce a replica in the computer, and if it's close enough, then it's not just a simulation, but it's an emulation. There is a one-to-one correspondence between what's going on. This is a bit like how I can sometimes run programs for old computers on my modern computer, because it actually simulates every circuit in the old computer. Now, if everything works out fine, Then you take a brain and probably a body model, and you run it in this new computer, and you get a software replica of the original being. Now, if that would be me, then we might hope that that produces not just something that talks like me and quacks like me and walks like me and is a duck, Anders, but actually has an inner life, consciousness, something that is very similar, not necessarily perfectly identical, because we're not even perfectly identical to ourselves day by day. We change quite a bit every time we go to sleep or change opinion about a question. Now, back in 2008, we at the FHI pulled together a little workshop where people who were interested in these questions were sharing knowledge, and we wrote a kind of roadmap where we sketched out what would it take, how much computing power is needed. Well, that depends actually on how much is needed to simulate a brain, and nobody knows that even to this day. So we can do various models. We can imagine that you can use some kind of good old-fashioned AI model of every part of the brain on a very high level, or you can go down and say, yeah, it's actually cortical columns connected to each other. We can ignore the individual neurons, but we can kind of simulate it as an artificial neural network over to more biological ones, over to compartment models where you simulate every small part of a neuron and the biochemistry and voltages, down to molecular simulation, and heaven forbid that we might end up on an atomic or quantum simulation. And as you go deeper down in resolution, you of course end up needing more and more data and more computing power. That means that if the brain is fairly simple, like maybe some philosophers once believed, we should just scan the logical structure of my thinking and could run it on a very small computer, probably on a phone or an old 286 computer or something like that. If it's more biological, well, we're going to need a really big supercomputer by today's standard. And yeah, if it's quantum, we're probably not going to be able to pull it off. We don't know where the reality lies here, but we can make models. For example, we can look at Moore's law and make predictions. When will that cross various computational demands and get a probability distribution roughly well? We can also start looking into, well, what do we know about good modalities for measuring the brain? And this turns out to be a really key issue, because doing this without actually damaging the brain seems very hard. It might be that once we get really good nanotechnology, we can actually do this while the brain is running. Some of you might have read Hans Moravec's Mind Children, where he has this interesting scenario where a robot is doing brain surgery on you and gradually transferring your consciousness into a computer, neuron by neuron. And at any point in time, you can press stop if you don't feel right. That's more of a thought experiment, I think, than something real. But Robert Freitas has an interesting scenario about using nanoprobes to do it. The problem is you need really good nanotechnology for it. A more near-term thing is you take a brain, you put it in formaldehyde or fixate it in some other way, you slice it up, you scan with an electron microscope, you take the three-dimensional structure, you segment it using computer vision algorithms, you deduce the connectivity and end up with something that you then run. This has been done for the fruit fly brain, or at least half of a fruit fly brain. There was an amazingly good paper actually this week where they found that the mushroom bodies in that fruit fly brain were frighteningly similar in some functions to what we have in our brains. We have much more, but actually the overall schematic of fruit flies and our brains on a sufficiently crude level actually seem to be somewhat similar. We just need to scale that up a lot. And then, of course, you have a whole laundry list of, can we actually get all the relevant information here? So this I've probably gone on for a little bit too long about the details here, but the interesting question is, what has happened since 2008? Well, first of all, we created a bit more of a community working on this as an actual vision. We started writing papers. We started actually working a bit more on it. Kenneth Hayworth, of course, had been pushing for developing some of these technologies for scanning. And back in 2008, we were kind of envisioning this as, whoa, just imagine if. And just a few years later, these technologies started coming around. Actually, knife-edge scanning microtomes, well, they were already a little bit of a thing. Now they're better. Kenneth developed even better techniques. And then connectomics became a thing. People who didn't believe in brain emulation as anything sensible still said, yeah, I really want to have that neural connectivity for my neuroscience research. So let's make the tools. And then the interesting revolution happened that we also got machine learning involved in actually making the tracing better. So Sebastian Seung has been doing a wonderful work on EyeWire, which is a project on understanding the retina. Now, the interesting part about that project is that first he tried to use filling algorithms and computer vision algorithms to figure out what's connected to what. But they were not quite up to the task. Human volunteers were actually fairly good at filling out neurons, except that postdocs absolutely refused to do this more than 6 hours at a time. Then they start looking for some other task to do. But internet volunteers are weird people. After all, you kind of find the weirdest people who like something and have them work for you. So what he did was just having a citizen science project where a lot of people were marking neurons in these data sets, which is then useful for training algorithms to actually do the right kind of tracing. And this way, we are getting better and better algorithms for doing it. So now connectomics is rushing ahead really well. And we have scanning methods, which are still too small, but they're starting to become insect size, which is good enough to actually get good data. We still haven't even gotten the C. elegans model to work. This is embarrassing because we know the connectivity for the 300 free neurons in the little nematode worm since the 80s, but we don't know the synaptic strength. The open worm and the related projects, however, built very nice body simulators, and you can run it. It's just that we need better ways of measuring the synaptic weights. The problem with that worm is that the synapses are much smaller than in many of the other model insects like Drosophila or in mammals. So it's probably the wrong animal to start at. So getting to today. Today we're sitting in a world where Moore's law is kind of slightly more rickety than I would like it to be, except that it's still doing great in terms of parallel power, which is what you want for brain emulation. The scanning ability has scaled up rather nicely. It's still not enormous, but we don't need that because we need to test it out on insects and small brains. People's abilities to do tracing of neurons is advancing amazingly well. Unfortunately, my friends in computational neuroscience don't seem to have yet been up to the task of automatically taking these connectomes and converting them into neural networks that actually runs. Partially this is because of academic reasons. You ideally want to work on a network you know what it's supposed to do, rather than having this weird thing that you don't understand. But partially I think this is something that's going to change now when the data is available. It's going to be sooner or later some grad student just can't avoid deciding, what happens if I actually try to run it? We also seen some very big projects have interesting effects. So the Human Brain Project in Europe both had a bit of interesting Game of Thrones infighting, which is what happens if you put all the neuroscience money on a continent into one big project. But it also did produce a lot of very useful infrastructure for sharing models between different disciplines in neuroscience. Meanwhile, the Kavli-Obama Brain Project in America focused on getting better methods for getting a lot of data out, including things like DNA barcodes to identify synaptic connections, which is probably going to be really revolutionary in the near future. We're getting some entirely new modalities of scanning neurons and investigating where stuff is that actually probably is going to get the computational neuroscientists up to speed. So I'm kind of happy to say that I think brain emulation is puffing along faster than I would have expected in 2008. It's still kind of slower than the rabbit of artificial intelligence, which really got going somewhere in 2010 to everybody's surprises, because before that it'd just been sitting there munching a bit on a carrot and then suddenly rushed off and seemed to be running now in the direction of AGI. Except, of course, that we all know that AI has done that before, and it might very well start running off in a random other direction. I regard brain emulation as very much the tortoise. It's a tricky problem, it's a big problem, and is moving slowly, but in a rather steady way towards bigger nervous systems and a deeper understanding of how to simulate things. So unless AI gets there to software intelligence first, eventually we're going to get there.
All right. Well, that's a really good segue into Connor Lee's question / objection on superintelligence and whole brain emulations. Connor, go for it.
Yeah. Sorry. But yeah. So I'm one of the AI maximalist type people. It seems to me, both from the empirical, like how AI progress is currently happening, I know about the other AI winters and such, but it looks to me like not only are we making much more progress in AI towards AGI, but it also seems like a much easier problem. At least at its core, it seems that it seems unlikely that the zeroth order optimization of evolution would have found the most efficient way of implementing artificial general intelligence. And there might be narrow subsets of intelligence, like research, that doesn't need like locomotion, that we might be able to build in like a modular way before them. So my question is kind of like, is it even worth thinking much? Like I got into this field out of my interest for neuroscience and whole brain emulation, but I stopped doing that because I thought it seems much more likely that we're going to get strong AGI first, or even if we get whole brain emulation first, that would create such an increase in output of like science that we would then get AGI probably the next year. It feels like that AGI is like the much more long-term important thing. I just can't imagine a future where whole brain emulations are still important in 20,000 years.
Well, Robin Hanson actually had some arguments for when it could be possible. It has to do basically with the economics of thinking. Is it useful to use lumpy things like brains versus some more a cloud, so to say, of intelligence services? And it's of course deeply linked to a real headache of a question. Well, what kind of intelligence is most useful? And I think that is worth investigating much more than it has before. Because traditionally, AI was thinking in terms of the AI, the robot. There is a discrete entity that is kind of close to the environment, that is acting in the environment, and we just want to figure out what to put into that box and then have it go off and do useful stuff. And in practice, of course, this is not how many animals even work, because many animals are actually collectives like anthills, and even we are in some sense collectives. And indeed, human thinking is a relatively collective thing. An individual human is usually fairly useless, but have a bunch of us together and we can do pretty amazing things. So, for example, Eric Drexler's comprehensive AI services demonstrate that you could actually dissolve things and get a much more cloud-like form of AGI. Which is, we might argue whether you think that's likely or a good thing, etc., etc. But there is a bigger space here of possible structures. But the real question here is, of course, strategy. Where do I want to put my hours of work? And I think it's true that at first brain emulation seemed to be a great way of getting to superintelligence, but then AI started taking off a fair bit. It might also be that, current methods are not going to run all the way. It's very unclear whether deep neural networks are the ticket. You might get into, of course, the Gary Marcus versus everybody else debate here, but I think he's got an important point. However, GPT-3 also demonstrates that good enough fakery can sometimes be the real thing. So I would argue that, GPT-3 is totally faking intelligence. It's just borrowing the intelligence present in having read all of the internet and perhaps interacting with humans. But that's good enough to actually do things that matter. Being able to translate legal prose into plain English and plain English into correct legal prose, that's a darn useful ability to have, even if you're not intelligent. So it might very well be that we solve a lot of these problems, the kind of lowercase AI rather than AGI, and that's already going to be pretty transformative. Now you might say, but that's not the strategic important thing. I want to solve the world's real big problems, and that probably requires AGI rather than having an enormous amount of descendants of GPT-3 up in the cloud doing a little bit of fake intelligence and solving various narrow tasks rather well, even though anything you can name, you can get solved. Because typically we won't solve the problems we can't name. I think that is the G in the general intelligence that we're truly interested in, and also somewhat scared of. This is, of course, where the whole AI safety issue comes in. Because if it was just a lot of powerful, narrow AI, we could probably figure out ways of controlling that fairly well. Malicious uses, well, it's a tricky problem, but again, it's fairly manageable. Getting something that is absolutely unpredictable because we're not smart enough, oh, that's much more problematic. This is where value alignment comes in and becomes super relevant. So when you get into that strategy question, the VBE versus AGI, I would say, yeah, I would totally go for AGI right now. However, VBE is also helping us understand a lot of neuroscience, which is useful for a lot of other things. After all, we want to be smarter. We want to be happier. I spent yesterday reviewing social pain, for example. We understand physical pain decently well in the human organism. I would still just say we're not that great at it, which is weird because this is one of the worst things ever. And yet we are not that great at managing pain. And social pain is kind of a more recent discovery. Some of the social and emotional forms of suffering are running on basically the same neural substrate as some of the affective parts of the pain system. And this has been studied for maybe a decade, maybe a little bit longer. That's not much. If we understood this way better, we would actually be able to help a lot of people who are hurting tremendously. So there are good reasons to do a fair bit of neuroscience too. It's just that from a kind of strategy standpoint, probably AGI will give you a bigger bang for buck right now. It might be that the current boom peters out and we have another winter, but in that case, you can always join us in the neuroscience department.
All right. Well, thank you. I think that, Connor is saying a few things here on the chat. So I welcome those, who want to engage more on that AGI thread to do so in the chat. If you don't mind, I will pick another one of the rolling in questions. So let's kind of like zoom out there again and kind of like take it one step back. We had one question that was by David Wood on, post-scarcity civilization, how do we even get there in terms of coordination? And then afterwards we can discuss exactly what post-scarcity actually means, if you don't mind. We're taking it a little bit back and I'm muting David Wood first with this question. David, you should be able to speak.
So, hi, Anders. I'll start off with the meta question you raised a few minutes ago, which is where should we be putting our hours of work, and all the interesting things that we could be looking at. And the question is really, should we be looking at individual intelligences or rather coordinated, collective intelligences, given that a lot of what we might try to do as individuals can be frustrated if we are living in a very chaotic and discoordinated world, as we seem to be today, in which many of the sensible decisions don't get taken because they require people to invest in public goods, and we don't have the mechanisms to do that. The United Nations, the WHO, the CDC, the other Bretton Woods institutes seemed no longer to be so effective. So to come to your topic of augmenting intelligence, do you have ideas for how we can augment the collective intelligence of these institutions? Is it something we should worry about? And can we make these institutions work better, or should we be building new institutions? Like, for example, should the Foresight Institute just get bigger and bigger and take over some of the tasks which currently are being held in these other rather venerable and ancient organizations?
I think it's a really important question. So in my book, originally I had planned to have it in 3 parts. The first part was kind of immature civilization. What are the problems right now and how do we solve them? Then there is the middle part, maturing civilizations, how do we become a real super civilization? And then the final third, super civilization, basically what are the ultimate limits? Sensible people around the office pointed out, look, Anders, this is way too much already. So I cut down on the first part. That has to be a second book or something. But the only thing that remains is kind of a chapter where I'm trying to look at the current predicament. And it seems to me that there are kind of 3 things that we need to work the most on here. So one is just reducing the really urgent X risk so we actually do get that. The second one is improving coordination, and the third one is improving insight. So this is borrowing a little bit from a diagram many of you have probably seen in Nick Bostrom's work, where he's kind of thinking about technology, insight, coordination. We have a little spacecraft that needs to navigate an asteroid belt of various risks and problems, and you need to improve them in the right path, because you don't just want to get technological power without coordination or insight, and coordination without insight is also going to lead us astray. Now the coordination part is interesting because we are already a really coordinated species. It's actually quite amazing that we're complaining about our inability to coordinate because we are doing things that no other species on this planet can dream about. It's just that we can dream. We actually have ambitions that are way bigger than our coordination ability. The cool thing about human coordination is that we can create joint intentions. As a group, we can decide on certain goals, and they become a joint goal. We can distribute tasks in a flexible way because we have language. We can remember them even over generations by having a cumulative culture. And we can even create incentive structures that make us do the right thing. If we were a Stone Age tribe, we could decide tomorrow we're going hunting. And we decide on a strategy, and we decide on how to divide the spoils so there is no quarrel after the hunt. That is amazing, and we can build better and better systems. And this is, of course, the story of history and civilization, but we have invented various tools for doing this better. In some cases, it's formal institutions. In some cases, external tools like laws. And in some cases, it's actual pieces of software. So when you think about Kickstarter, it's a coordination tool that I think is amazing on its own, because it allows people who want certain things to happen to pool together resources, put them into escrow, be fairly certain that if this works, it's going to happen, and then we are going to get our product. And that seems to work. And this seems to be roughly how we have improved our coordination ability. The problem is, of course, it's still running mostly on our squishy brains, and we cannot handle more than 150 direct personal connections. And scaling it up to handle much more would require a way bigger brain. We probably need to actually have software and other hardware helping us with that. But even a slight improvement of that would probably have a pretty powerful effect on our social world. Indeed, you could argue that the Rolodex and the other ways of keeping track of business cards have actually enhanced our ability to coordinate and build big projects tremendously. Now, where I want to go with this is that I think institution building is a very important thing, unless we can actually do a direct biological enhancement. Social media also demonstrates that there are some interesting risks here. We certainly know that our institutions can be super dangerous. After all, if I were to list the most dangerous inventions humanity have made, I would say governments is up there in the top 5, probably above nuclear weapons. Because when you look at situations where a lot of people have been killed, actually governments killing their own or other people have been the cause. Finding good ways of keeping governments in check and behaving well is actually a rather urgent problem. It's just as much of an alignment problem as we have for AGI. Indeed, you could argue that governments are AGI being run as software on a lot of human minds. Now, some ways of doing this might be, of course, to come up with entirely new institutions. I kind of like also the idea that if you have a good solution, you can expand it. This is a bit like Mark Miller's attempt at spreading a good security system in the world of computers. We took the wrong path down in the 70s, and now we're kind of suffering from the bad computer security. It's possible to make secure operating systems and secure applications, but right now the economics is against it. What we can do, though, is of course demonstrate it for those few applications where it works really well, and then slowly expand, bringing more and more into that safe bubble. And I think this is true also for building better coordination. But the third thing here, the insight part, is important. We want to figure out key insights rather early on. Nick calls it the crucial considerations. If you're following a map, discovering that you're holding the map upside down is something you want to figure out very early. Otherwise, you will have gone far in the wrong direction. So we might want institutions like Foresight get the insights early to guide the rest. Sorry, this got a bit long-winded, but it's a great question.
Yeah,
great answer, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's a lovely question, and I think a lot of follow-up questions, would immediately follow up. But I think in the interest of taking a little bit time for the upvoted questions here, I think John Chisholm had a question on what exactly, and that pertains still to what you discussed at the beginning, but I think it's actually interesting to talk about what exactly does a post-scarcity civilization look like? And he had a little bit more of an expansion. So John, I'm going to unmute you right now if you'd like to.
Allison, thanks so much. And Anders, thank you. This question may be so basic, don't spend more time on it if it's not of general interest, but what exactly does post-scarcity mean? Does it mean that the goods and services we know of today are at some point in the future in abundant supply, free? What about the goods and services that won't yet have been discovered or invented at that point in the future? Won't those still be scarce? And won't there thus always be some goods and services which are scarce no matter how far in the future we're considering? Our friend Catherine Moronic volunteered on the online chat that there might be levels of abstraction of post-scarcity. If so, are those levels well defined?
And also, are there any things that are inherently not post-scarce? Like, I think you talked a little bit about, like, you know, perhaps like zero-sum preferences or something along those lines. And I'd be curious to hear that too, if I may expand on you, John.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think this is a very important question. And when I started writing the book, I had a plan. And of course, I need to write about post-scarcity. And then I started looking into post-scarcity writing, and I found quite a lot of them are annoyingly narrow, because we basically talk about a state where most goods can be produced in great abundance with minimal human labor, so they're in principle freely available. But they're usually thinking in terms of material stuff. And certainly it's kind of nice to have a world where you get enough phones and books and food to get by. That's kind of convenient, but there is more to life than that. When you start thinking about it, economics is typically defined as allocating scarce resources. And so in some sense, once you achieve post-scarcity, you will know because economics disappears. Except that there are some resources that are probably always going to be scarce in various ways. So one interesting example is time. Time is a really weird resource. Every little voxel of the universe gets allocated time at nearly the same rate all the time. But at the same time, it's irreversible. If you waste your time, it can never come back. It's, in some sense, ultimately the non-renewable resource. Now, it's also relative to what you want. If I'm a total asket, I don't need that fancy food. I don't need the car. I don't need a lot of stuff. In that case, I might be in a post-scarce situation, even though you might say that I'm actually living in poverty. And we can imagine somebody who really needs a gold-plated house to feel really happy. So the relationship here to what we can achieve and what we want is fluid. We could imagine genetically engineering ourselves to not want high social status and fancy stuff. If everybody felt that boiled rice was the most delicious thing ever and didn't want anything more, we would have achieved food post-scarcity as long as we had enough rice. It's just that most of us would say, that's perhaps missing a point here. Indeed, we want new things. Having a world that has new books or new inventions or new forms of art seems to be a better world than a world where everybody's content reading the same book and having the same kind of art. So when I started looking at it, it was clear that we certainly need a core to get to post-scarcity. We need the raw materials of various kinds. There is always a material underpinning. We need the energy to process them. And I think that is the crucial thing here that is actually going to affect what kind of post-scarcity you can do. You need some space where the things can be located and done. And this is not trivial for post-scarcity, because the nicest corner at Lake Como, only one person can have a nice villa there. It doesn't matter that with the right technology, you could build 1,000 villas. There is only one really nice, beautiful spot there out with the right view. So we have various inherent problems even there. But more important, we have also a cognitive aspect of scarcity. Something needs to do the information process that actually perform the mental tasks. We also need the transformation ability, the manufacturing of nanotechnology or the biotechnology to do the transformation. And indeed, we need the coordination systems that allocates things and make sure that the material is where the energy is, where the tools are, and then get sent to the person who really wishes for that nice villa at the lakeside. So these things are already interesting and non-trivial because we can analyze them, of course, from a technical and physical standpoint. But there is also this fundamental thing that there are some things that you cannot make. You can't go back in time. Attention is limited, and similarly, social status is quite often a zero-sum game. In many situations, only one person can be coolest at the party. Now, it's kind of a weird situation because I might want to be coolest among the academics at the party because I have the most publications. But some of you are just going to laugh at that because you're way better at bicycling, which is a really cool thing, and you don't care about the papers in Nature. And of course, the boxing champion is thinking, but no, why are those nerds talking about biking and publishing? Because I'm the best in the ring. So this is one way we solve the zero-sum game of social status. We find a lot of dimensions of status. In the best of all possible worlds, we would all, of course, have our own favorite direction and only care about that one, and then we would always be best. In practice, it doesn't work like that, because what we want is, of course, others to acknowledge us. So we have this weird game that we want to be in a kind of zero-sum game with other people, because we do care about being good, or at least belonging to a group that thinks they're good. And this produces an awful lot of strife, of course, and complications. It's also interesting to think about other aspects of things that are hard to allocate. There are some physics like radio spectrum that is tricky to allocate. Again, we have only a finite amount of that. There are some things like randomness that actually the universe seems to be pretty powerful in generating. Radio spectrum is scarce only if you have low technology. So when you get better technology, some scarcity just go away. And I think that is a good way of also getting to post-scarcity in quite a lot of domains. So I've been kind of making a jumble here of a much bigger argument in the book that there are some forms of economics that you can't get rid of. But perhaps most importantly, it's also not about material stuff. Services are probably even more important. This is where AI becomes irrelevant. Because if I just have a lot of material goods, that's not as good as having somebody who cooks a nice meal for me. If I'm doing it, it's going to be fairly mediocre. I'm not bad as a cook, but I could be way better. It might be fun, of course, for me to learn how to cook better, but sometimes I just want a delicious meal, and then it's nice if somebody can do that. So automating services, having a post-scarcity of services might actually be way more profound than post-scarcity of material as goods. But it's also much harder to understand because it's linked to cognition, intelligence, etc. Now we need to predict where are the limits of what we can achieve with AI. There might be even more profound forms of post-scarcity, of course, because we might also want post-scarcity of happiness. Normally, we tend to think of happiness and well-being as something very different, but actually, a lot of what we consume is to make us happier, or at least we think it will make us happy. If we could just get happiness directly, that might actually be the ultimate form of post-scarcity society. So I've been working on a paper together with Thomas Moynihan, who's an awesome historian, about the history of wireheading. It turns out that people were worried about being able to generate pleasure using technology long before anybody put any electrode into a rat's brain. And there is this general concern that, wait a minute, getting happy in the wrong way might be really bad. A lot of Greek philosophers spent a lot of nice afternoons arguing about what the right form of happiness is. But at the same time, it's pretty obvious that right now depression and bad feelings are very common. A lot of people are not feeling as happy as we should be. We actually do have a bit of a happiness scarcity. It's also very different forms of scarcity because material scarcity, we can imagine moving around. We can start talking about reallocation or UBI. But allocating happiness, it's not like I can somebody can tax my very happy mood and use some of that happiness to make some unhappy people happier. That would be a really weird world. It probably makes for a very fun science fiction story. But what we actually need is some very different kind of infrastructure. So when you summarize the whole question of post-scarcity, it looks like, yeah, we can probably get way less scarce. We can probably solve a lot of the really urgent problems. But it doesn't look like we're going to solve all of it, including that some of the problems might be, yeah, we want a certain amount of friction, certain amount of risk that makes stuff meaningful. If everything was guaranteed to be perfect, most of us would be bored. So of course, a perfect world would also have the right amount of imperfections of things to fight for. And I think this is a constraint satisfaction problem that's actually unsolvable even with arbitrary amount of computation. So in practice, because of computational limits of the world and awkward things like the light speed limit and the entropy, you actually end up with a world where there are actually going to be a fair bit of interesting scarcities to deal with. But there is so much we can do on the way there. Actually get into a world that has sustainable non-carbon energy, and that's rather useful. Being able to recycle matter endlessly, well, that's going to be pretty good for the planet. Being able to manufacture and service practically anything, I can see some uses for that. So I think there is quite a lot of things we can do to actually flesh out post-scarcity way beyond what people currently are doing, because most people are still thinking about just making a lot of stuff. But it might be the making that is interesting. So Marx might have been right. It's kind of a means of production of post-scarcity that is where we want to figure out how to get them.
Okay, thank you. And again, there's a lot of threads I think that were opened by that answer. I think Alyssa had a question. She has to leave soon. I also want to say we're already 3 minutes past the hour. I don't know how much time.
Yeah, sorry for being long-winded.
No, this is amazing. I just want to be mindful of your time. I know that probably there's like a host of variety of questions still in the chat. If you still have time to stay on, but I just want to do a time check in case you have to hop off. But just feel free anytime to say, okay, now I have to go. I do have a question by Alyssa who has to go now, and then we can come back to the AGI thread, which has been uploaded a lot, and perhaps Forrest Landry and then David Wood can summarize their 2 AI questions. David Wood try to summarize one from the chat, and then we can kind of take up that AGI thread again. But first, Alyssa, let's hear it from you.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Cool. Just wondering which of this cool stuff that you've been talking about has been published. So I know the book hasn't been published yet. The diagram that you talked about where we did, tech trees for, these dozen different future technologies, is that online anywhere where people can dig into that, or is that still in draft form?
Today, when preparing for this talk, I realized, darn, it's not online. It was, I better leak this because it's supposed to be part of another report, which I don't know whether it's public or not, but I think it wouldn't be very hard to put it online, or I could turn it online, because I think there is something interesting in doing that analysis pathway. I want to develop this as a proper tool, and for that I probably need a lot of criticism on how to make it better.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks for making me do it.
All right. Thank you, Alyssa. And Alyssa had another question, which is, I think, something that she took from someone else, and I'm just going to ask it if I can find it again. But I think one of the questions that she was modeling was, what would you ask? Describe what is wrong with the world in one sentence. What would you say?
Oh, sorry, I wasn't intending that as a question, but you could go ahead with that if you want.
Okay, well then it's I'll take it on me, even though I'm also copying it from someone. Alyssa, do you mind if I ask her the question? Okay, she's now
what's wrong with the world in one question? It's almost like original sin, or what's wrong with you humans? And I think my answer would be that we are kind of the stupidest possible technological species. The problem is we evolve better and better brains, better and better abilities to shape the world and coordinate. And eventually we reach a kind of critical mass. We got a cumulative culture, we expanded out of Africa, we took over the biosphere, and we did a lot of stuff. It's just that our ability to foresee the consequences are, of course, quite limited. In theory, you could imagine that if our brains had kept on going and we become smarter and smarter, it would have produced a much better outcome. Now, I think this is a little bit too facile, actually, as an answer, because I think super smart people create super smart problems for themselves, too. I have a lot of friends who created very smart, complicated problems. So it might be that a smarter species would still have this problem. The real problem is kind of wisdom. Actually finding the right goals. Knowing what makes you happy and actually doing it is something we're actually fairly bad at. So we're dumb enough to have a lot of power, but we're not doing stuff that actually makes us happy. We need to become a little bit better at that, and then I think we're going to get paradise on and off Earth.
All right, very nice. Quite poetic. Okay, so if you don't mind, I think we're gonna like shift gears again, and we're gonna get back to the AGI thread. And I will first take Forrest, and then I'm gonna take David Wood to ask your questions. And David summarized one from the chat really well, I think. And then let's see what you have to say to that, if you don't mind. Okay, so let's see. First, Forrest, I'm gonna unmute you now. I hope you don't mind.
Hey there. So, Anders, it's great to see you again. Been loving some of the things you've been doing. It's kind of a provocative question, but do you actually believe that there's any way to have general artificial intelligence alignment? So, in other words, is there any reasonable basis for us to presume any possibility of a solution to that problem, or do you think that it's something that can be even achieved? Is there any kind of proof of an existence of a solution of that class?
Yeah, I'm sorry I missed your talk about this because it is a wonderful provocative question. And my answer is, I don't know. I still think it's worth working on. I have a feeling that the general problem of can you always do alignment for any AGI, the answer is no, in the kind of boring sense that a mathematician can always find a sufficiently weird function to break some property you demand of a function. But if we look at AGIs that humans can make, and the AGIs being put to when they work in the environment of Earth's surface, etc., in that case, I think we can get good enough things. So Brad pointed out that he's not seen any workable proposal for human alignment, which is true, but we're getting good enough alignment. The real deep question, I think, is, do you have things like the hard takeoff scenario where alignment has to be really perfect or everything is lost? Or is it that you have softer takeoffs and not? We don't know yet. And I think hence there is good reason to work on it, because it just, well, it's valuable.
Okay, well, I'd love to confer with you at some point. At this point, I believe I have a general proof that there is no possibility of alignment in the general case, even for slow takeoff. But I don't want to divert now because that was another conversation. And but just I would love to confer and collaborate with you on that topic to sort of test out that proof to make sure it's good.
And I will post your conversation for us in the chat for those that want to follow up on that.
That's only half of the conversation. I only got a chance to develop the first half of the argument, so it's very incomplete.
Of course, as I think as it has to be with an hour and a half on this topic. Yeah. David, you are next. Hey, David, thanks for summarizing the chat so nicely.
So, Anders, as you know, there are some visionaries who say, don't worry about alignment with AGI because we will become the AGIs. You know, don't worry about robots taking over the world. We will be augmented and enhanced and be as the robots too. So in the grand futures that you foresee, is there a significant difference between, on the one hand, what comes next after humans, that's you and me enhanced and evolved at some stage, and on the other hand, the AGIs, which have come from the world of computer software, silicon software? Or will there just be one category of which we, post-humans and AGIs, are somehow all together?
So in writing the book, I'm kind of cheating because I can take a sufficiently high-level view to squint and ignore what are those things that are running these super civilizations. Maybe they're post-humans, maybe they're AGI, maybe they're sentient cockroaches. I don't need to care too much on the level I'm writing, which is, of course, very convenient for me and writing this. However, from a more practical standpoint, I think we actually do care about humanity having the right kind of future. It's kind of interesting to note that if humanity gets replaced with AGI that still continues human civilization, we might say that's actually fairly decent. On the other hand, if it's a completely alien AGI, that's bad. And if it's kind of cockroaches that have nothing to do with our civilization, we also would say something important has been lost here. Now, the problem is, this is more of a practical issue. Can we say something about pathways that work and the probability of getting them, or what actions do we need to take to get to them. So value alignment is the attempt, of course, of getting AGI that would in some sense be a continuation of a civilization, although we're of course hoping that once the existence is, we want to continue our civilization, they will want to help us continue our joint civilization, and then everything is going to be fine. The merger problem, on the other hand, this leads to an issue of both, can this work again well enough to enhance us? So unaligned AGI is not a problem, because this is a fairly common motivation people have for working on it. Indeed, I have a so far unpublished paper where I'm starting out with Elon Musk's talk where he explains that he doesn't want to be a house pet of the AIs. So that's why he wants to put money into Neuralink and enhance us. And it's easy to find interesting examples. Both Stephen Hawking and many other luminaries have suggested that we need to enhance ourselves to be smarter than the AGI. That probably is not going to work that well, because we have a speed limit at the very least. Even if we have a lot of enhancements, it's kind of unclear whether we can improve ourselves faster than we can improve AGI, because they're two very different technologies. Human enhancement and AI, although they share some technology in common, they could advance at very different rates. And there is no reason to think that human enhancement would be super fast, because biology is really messy. It's like retrofitting existing institutions. If we think fixing America or the UK is hard, just imagine fixing the human body. It's even worse in many ways. So I think that approach doesn't work. The idea that we could join the machines, however, is also tricky, because again, you want to have a hybrid continuation of humanity that both philosophically is a continuation, that we would say, look approving on our future cyborg selves and say, yeah, that's kind of me in the right way. But you also want that link to be right. So you could a bit facetiously say that according to the extended mind hypothesis, I'm already part machine because I have my smartphone and part of my mind resides in this one. But that means that if a paperclip AI takes over the world and turns everything into paperclips, in some sense, I was on the winning side because I was part machine, because I had a smartphone. Unfortunately, it's not going to help me at all, because me and my smartphone are all going to be paperclips. We didn't even have a meaningful link there. The real question is, can we link up with technology in such a way that we have meaningful control of the technology or meaningful influence of the outcome? And at this point, we're talking value alignment again, although it might not be value alignment in teaching an AI program to behave itself, but value alignment in teaching a larger techno-social system to behave it in the same way. So again, it seems like we might want to go to Neuralink and get our neural implants because neural implants are cool and useful, and I want to have one to control my weight set point and download Wikipedia results, so I'm even more annoying in my answers. But it's probably not going to be able to enhance us so we're smarter than the AIs. What we can do is having the AIs figure out ways of making us smarter instead, or maybe do brain emulation of ourselves where we can do a lot of software evolution and improve on ourselves.
I just want to drop a very quick footnote in here on this discussion of can AGIs be aligned with human values, or can we control the AGIs? Sorry, I didn't see either the talk that Forrest gave. That's something I should look up. But I do note that Roman Yampolsky, not quite sure how to pronounce his surname, Roman Yampolsky has just released free online a book-length paper on controllability of artificial intelligence. And he marshals all kinds of arguments why it cannot be controlled, or that the only way to control it is if we humans become very much changed in the process, so that we'll no longer be recognizably humans. So I just wonder if others have seen that. I've dropped a link into chat. I do recommend reading it. It's full of references. Maybe I knew about a third of them before, but there were 2/3 of it which was new to me, and so that was useful.
I think that I've seen that one, and it also contains an interesting discussion of AI wireheading, which actually turned into the kind of capstone of my paper on the history of wireheading, because it turns out that the problem of sending signals to the pleasure center also links up with the problem, of course, of making aligned AI. It all comes together in an important way because we want to control complex adaptive systems, and that's very tough. But getting your government working, avoiding addiction, and getting aligned AI, they might actually deep down be connected. There might be some universal similarities here we might want to solve.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, let's see. I'm still asking for other questions to be uploaded. I certainly agree on your last point. We had a recent discussion with Mark Miller on civilization as superintelligence and in which way different institutions and different organizations are intelligences and how we may align them, what we can learn from that for alignment of superintelligences, if anything. And okay, so let's see. One thing that I think, which is, I think, part of the reason why we got connected in the first place, which is just one thing that I want to make everyone aware of, because I haven't talked about it yet, and hopefully it's of interest, is your 3 bets on convergence. And I know that there's a lot to get into, but it was certainly something that kind of like blew my mind when I first heard about it, and I'm sure that a lot of people have a lot of things to say or think about that in the chat. So if you just want to kind of like tickle us with what they are, and then we can see if we have time to further discuss them.
Yeah, so this all began a few years back when Peter Eckersley, who many of you know, was visiting us at FHI, and he got into a discussion with Toby Ord, so we wrote a bet on our whiteboard. And the bet was basically, by the point when we meet independently evolved intelligent life in the universe, both we and the aliens are going to have stopped making meaningful technological progress. And Peter thinks, no, actually, at this point, we're both still building new stuff. We're still inventing new stuff. While Toby felt, no, actually, this is probably so far in the future, but we are going to have a leveled out. We have achieved roughly everything that can be achieved technologically. So that's kind of an interesting, bold claim about the nature of technology. Is it totally open-ended, or is there some limit? Of course, obviously, we can imagine cars with any integer number of fins on the car. We can do a lot of pointless variations. After all, there's an infinite number of computer programs to write, so in some sense, you can always add more programs. But do we do fundamentally different things? In some sense, meaningful technology, the technology you would actually want to tell the rest of the universe that you had invented, that might be a relative finite set. Now, this is on its own really a fun question, but then we started thinking, are there similar bets like that? So the second bet ended up being, well, what about science? Is there a limit to science? It could be that by the time we have expanded so far that we reach the end of greatness scale of the universe. So now we have a lot of samples of galactic superclusters. We can compare them. We've seen a bunch of quasars. At that point, maybe our science would have kind of stopped doing empirical stuff, because we've basically seen examples of everything. There are open questions, of course, in mathematics, but basically you don't need to do much empirical stuff. Or it could be that, yeah, you're still going to do experiments because there's still going to be weird new emergent phenomena happening. The third bet is, of course, the same thing, but on ethics. Well, by the point in time when humanity has expanded so far that different parts will start losing causal contact. At that point, will we have agreed on roughly the overall framework on ethics? Not that we all agree with each other. It might be that we figured out that just like there are 17 wallpaper groups, there are 17 consistent ethical positions you can take. And then people have various opinions about which one they like the most. Or it could be that people are still coming up with ethical systems and the new forms of ethics, and actually we still don't fully agree on what ethics truly is. So these 3 bets, we're kind of writing up a paper where we're having people take different sides in the bets. It's all about how open-ended is the important stuff in the universe. How open-ended is value? Could there be that there is an infinite list of possible things to value, and they're all proper values? It's actually right to value some of these things. Or is it that, yeah, actually there is a finite list? There are 5 things that all intelligent beings ought to value, and that's it. The rest is kind of personal aesthetics. Now, people have very different intuitions. David Deutsch, who I've been trying to entice into taking the ethics bet versus me, or no, it's a science bet actually that I'm trying to get him to take. He thinks things are open-ended, very, very strongly open-ended. And it's very fun to argue with him because we both have intuitions about the shape of the space of possible sciences, which is weird because we don't know everything. We just have this based on our very finite sampling of science known to us.
So would you say your counterpart for that on the ethics part is Robin Hanson?
I think the ethics bet is Robin Hanson versus, I forgot who else it was. I need to look it up actually.
All right. Okay. And do you think they're conditional upon each other in some way? So that, you know, if you knew that one of them was converging, would you say, okay, now the other one is also more likely to converge? Or
I think ethics is the most independent one. So it's kind of interesting because if you're a relativist, you would of course say, yeah, well, there is actually no real truth, so it's always open-ended. And then you have people like Immanuel Kant saying, no, all sufficiently rational agents will converge to my ethical system. But that's very different from the technological underpinnings. And technology and science are linked to each other. So you could imagine that if technology is always a child of scientific understanding, so if I discover a new scientific principle, that allows me to do some new tech stuff. Then if science is open-ended, we can never be certain that technology will be closed. It might be that, yeah, for the past billion years, nobody has ever invented anything new, but the scientists are finding ever more bizarre states of matter, and sooner or later one of them is going to turn out to be useful for something. So that is a possibility. Indeed, it could turn out that many of these questions are undecidable in some strict mathematical sense, that actually physics is really weird. We can never be certain that we're completed it. In many ways, I think these bets are always going to be rather flawed. Trying to write a proper paper, defining them even, is actually a very good philosophical exercise, not just in reviewing a lot of people with very weird, firm opinions, but also trying to refine what do we mean by science? What do we mean by technology? What is a technology really? And in many ways, of course, they're really vague and annoying concept the closer you look at them, but that's the fun part. And bets are good because they actually focus you on trying to be exact. In fact, Immanuel Kant, in his work, he actually pointed out that the best way of getting people to show their true preferences about probability is to make a bet about it. That's actually found in his work. He's saying that many people who say they're absolutely certain become way less certain once there is a little bit of gold in the balance. And the funny thing is, 30 pages down the line, he's saying, oh yes, and I'm willing to accept a bet at any odds that there are intelligent life in the universe.
Oh man, okay. Who have you been able, or like who have you been able to convince to take those bets?
So it's Toby and Peter for the technology bet. I'm working with trying to convince the Deutsch to take the science bet, but we need to define it much better. So we're having meetings where we bicker quite a lot about that. And I think it's Robin and a friend of Peter's who is in politics, who's taken the ethics bet. But in many ways, I think it would be fun to have people around the Foresight Institute to join in on these bets. Maybe we should turn them into group bets. We are also trying to formulate it in such a way we can submit them properly to the long bets list. So that also requires things to actually involve some actual money, etc.
Yeah, I mean, that would be totally lovely. I would love to follow up on this. And I think I may see a Peter in here as well. Peter, do you have anything to say to that? If so, oh, and he's saying he's in a loud place. Never mind. Okay, sorry. But I just saw you. I just saw your initials, so I thought maybe you wanna fill in on something there. And thank you so much, Peter, for kicking this off. And certainly, I think one of the more I think. Inspiring projects, I think, on the very long term. And then this is an encouragement to everyone here to try out, if you want to, raise your hand, and then we'll see whether we can do like a very short question round if Anders is still on in the chat. Okay, I see the first one here by Brad Templeton. Brad, keep it nice and short and sweet. Here you go.
I mean, just history is littered with people believing a field was about to be complete. Has there ever been an example where they were right?
Well, there are the fields that just failed, where alchemy turned out to be a dead end, but it got transmuted hilariously into chemistry.
Yeah, that's not an answer to my question.
Yeah, there are also small. I think there are areas where we know roughly what we're doing. I mean, classical mechanics has not fundamentally changed after Hamiltonian mechanics over the applications.
But only by calling it classical mechanics.
Yeah, I do think that there is actually something fundamental about it. I like your question. I don't think I can give a super short answer. In fact, it kind of inspires me to go to that part of my book and see if I can put the answer in there. I think the proper answer is not strictly. But there are some disciplines where I think people did finish stuff and then people realize, yeah, the actual problem is over there anyway.
Well, I'd be interested if you found something outside of subfields of mathematics where you can then claim by definition the field is complete because you defined the problem in a way that it's completable. But outside of that, I'm not sure you'll find any.
Yeah, and the doomsday conjecture is a hilarious example where a subfield discovered that it didn't exist. But that's a weird special case.
All right. If there's any other short questions, please feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, I would love to see, oh, we have another question here. George, I'm going to unmute you. You're actually raising your real physical hand. Okay. It took me a while to see that. Here you go.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask if how we might apply this thought to fungi and mycelium networks in nature and their progression and your thoughts on that in comparison to humans.
That's a good question because we haven't studied fungi very much. It's kind of embarrassing that we know so little about the Mayor Kingdom of Life, which is actually doing quite a lot of very important things, whether you're in agriculture and thinking about soil, over to the issues of immunology, etc. And generally, I think it's a good example of a low-hanging fruit of ignorance. There are many relatively simple domains where people haven't been studying it enough. Lesions is another good example. A lichen is a symbiosis between an algae and fungi. We all heard that in school, except that it turns out that they need bacteria too, which was discovered, I think, about 10 years ago, which ought to have been kind of obvious, but it isn't. It's a little bit like microbiomes. Yeah, it ought to have been obvious. It wasn't, and it might actually be a pretty major thing. So right now, I don't think I can say that much about fungi because more work is needed. A lot more work is needed.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, let's see. Okay, so we are now at 29. I would say I'm going to open up the breakout rooms just at 30, but I do want to kind of like give you the chance to close it out with something that you'd like this audience to know, or you know, if you don't have anything handy, then maybe kind of foreshadow something what we can expect in the really long future, just to kind of like expand our horizons a little bit and give us a big, even if far away carrot to hold on to while we're moving through COVID.
First, what have I learned by attempting to write this book? Well, actually trying to write a really broad book is actually a fun thing because almost anything is related and you actually get motivated to put stuff in. And then you start to realizing what you need to learn more. So this has been very much of an exploration for me that has shown me that a surprising number of things are like the fungi question. There are these elementary things that we ought to know that seem to matter quite a bit, that very few people have worked very well on. Like, what's the statistical lifetime of civilizations? Or how long does software actually last? There ought to be much better knowledge about that than there actually is. So there is a lot of these low-hanging fruits of ignorance that we ought to be working on. And we should probably try to collect lists of these questions in a better way, because there are very few good repositories. Whenever students come to me and ask, so what should I work on? If I'm lucky, I've just been bashing my head against something interesting and I can tell them about it. But quite often I, of course, forgotten the 20 things that I realized this is super important and somebody ought to work on. Hopefully my book can at least contain a long list of questions I haven't been able to answer. So turning to what have I learned in writing the book that is relevant for the long-term future? And I think the biggest surprise for me was matter is so darn cool. So in Western civilization, we have this saying kind of mere matter. Oh, it's information, it's knowledge, it's energy. All these things are really, really amazing and powerful. But it actually turns out that the behavior of matter itself is really complex. Indeed, it looks like we actually don't have a full theory about states of matter. In some directions, it looks like an open-ended problem. And we certainly don't know if it actually is a finite number. Indeed, there are some good reasons to think this might be open-ended in a very complicated way. After all, biology is a particular kind of matter that does very funky stuff. And that leads to the final point that we are a phase transition of matter. We are an organization of matter that can actually organize other matter on larger and larger scales. And this seems to be an interesting form of physics, basically. Can we describe the phase transitions that matter can do in the universe? And it seems that it's rather important to bring in questions about intelligence and life and self-replicating systems. Because without those parts of the description of what matter does in the universe, we're probably missing on a quite central thing. Yes, normal matter gravitates and builds stars and forms gases, but it might also build spaceship and reorganize galaxies into shapes based on the ideas the matter has. So I think actually understanding matter is way more funky than it sounds like when you get introduced to the states of matter or solid state physics. There is much more to be discovered about matter itself.
All right. I think that's a lovely way to finish. And I was just trying to research a really good post by Leahy on nothing is mere, which I thought was also a really, really hopeful piece from Unless Wrong. I'll try to find the link and post it in here just because it said mere matter. Okay, great. So let's see. Anders, I can't thank you enough. I think we've done a crazy wild tour through this. And, when you asked me, okay, can you specify, which part of grant features you want me to focus on? I was like, it was really, the agony of choice here. And I think even within that part, there's so many different subparts and we're just starting to unravel a few threads. Meanwhile, needless to say, we're all terribly excited for your book to come out. I would really, really love to love to do everything possible to steer that along, because I do think it's one of the things that I'm most looking forward to in the next few years. So I think there's a lot to look forward to, even just on that end.
I'm looking forward to your book too. So we have to race here.
Okay, let's race. Hopefully no race to the bottom.
No. It's always a race to the top, except that there is probably no top. It's kind of race to the supremum. There is this limit that we're aiming at.
Okay, good. Okay, let's leave it at that, and definitely no pressure on my end there. But thank you so much for joining. This was fantastic. I think you've lifted a lot of people's moods. Oh, actually, fun thing I could do in the end, if I click on polling, I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share it with everyone, just that you are aware of what other people here think in this chat and where everyone else is from. So we had 26% new attendees. Most of you were in North America, but we have a few of you really visiting from all over the place. Everyone, let's say 47% was already feeling a 4, even when we started this meeting, and I'm sure many of you are a little bit more optimistic even after this meeting. And then I think the main priority of everyone here is AI, AGI, and computing in terms of topics, and it is followed by cognitive enhancement, I think, if I'm correct, in terms of topics. So I think we really covered that thread, quite thoroughly. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for being able and so flexible and answering so many different curveball questions. For everyone else who'd like to stay on, I'm going to open up one breakout room now in which you can mingle. I won't be in there, so please be nice to each other. Please maybe introduce yourselves in the chat so people know who they're talking with. Anders, I cannot thank you enough. I'm hoping that I may ping you in the future again to join. And
I think that's kind of something that's obvious, but given that there's so many great questions I see in flickering past that I couldn't even get to, so we need to do more of this. We need to run this every week or something.
Well, I have you on record, and I'll definitely hold you accountable. All right, no pressure, unless it's taking time away from you writing the book, in which case, no, I won't.
No problem. This is inspiring because Brad's question, for example, actually told me, I need to explicitly give a proper answer to that. So thanks.
All right, lovely. Well, then I'm hoping that I'll see most of you again next Thursday here. And Anders, I'll follow up with you. I'm going to open up one breakout room for those who want to continue chatting. Please introduce yourself there. This is it from me for now. And please join us again next week. Thank you so much, Anders. And thank you to everyone else. Those were fantastic questions. I can't wait for the next round of this. All right, everyone. Bye-bye. Breakout room.